Hi there, fellow survivors and all you killers out there. My name's Matt, and welcome to another edition of the Campfire, a series of character and lore analyses on Dead by Daylight. Now, if you've been following along, and no harm or judgment if not, you may remember a place I mentioned a chat or two ago. Places are just as important as survivors and killers in the trials. They set the framework and the setting for the hunting grounds that must be taken advantage of or survived. Each of these arenas, though, has a correlation to one of the killers, and they're places where grave misfortune has occurred, usually resulting in a large number of casualties or people who have gone missing. And these places become kind of a home turf for the entity's minions, a place of familiarity where they can continue to wreak havoc. One such place is the area I've mentioned before and want to explore a little bit, at least verbally. The Crotus Prenn Asylum. So what do we know factually about the asylum? Well, it wasn't always used as an asylum. When it was built in 1857, the grounds were home to a hospital treating the sick and injured. As the need for housing for the mentally unsound started to reveal itself, Crotus Prenn started to take on those who had nowhere else to be treated, evolving into an asylum meant to treat them or, more than likely, keep them away from the general public. Over time, the hospital officially changed its purpose to an asylum, and much like many of those kinds of institutions from the time, the methods of treatment and diagnosis were less than humane. Horrible stories started to circulate about how the patients were treated under Warden Patrick Spencer's watchful but clearly uncaring eye. Somehow, Crotus Prenn became the home of some of the most vile and depraved people in the country. It's not clear as to whether this pertains to the patients before or after their treatments, or the people running the institution. Despite the chapel on the grounds, it has been documented, but most likely never spoken by the people it affected, that there were accounts of abuse against both patients and staff, including one unfortunate nurse, Sally Smithson. While Campfire regulars may be familiar with the nurse, her story is for another time, though the reason the asylum's image was pulled into the entity's realm is closely tied to her. Again, that's for another time. Where the story of Crotus Prenn's awful practices ends is in a mass homicide, resulting in the deaths of 50 patients and 4 staff members, all found in their beds. There was no conclusive evidence as to how it happened, but between the sudden loss of inhabitants and the stigma about how it happened, the asylum shut down shortly after. The story doesn't end there, though. Rumors started to spread that there was a woman seen drifting between the dilapidated walls and the chambers of the buildings. Stories even told that the woman lived there somehow. As those tales piled up, however, a strange thing happened. People from the neighboring town bore witness to a fire that consumed what it could of the old asylum, gutting it as it lit up the sky with an orange glow. No one did anything to try to stop it, most likely happy to see it and its dark history cleansed in the blaze. The burnt-out ruins of the Crotus Prenn Asylum have become the image that the entity twisted for his trial, and that the survivors have become, unfortunately, well acquainted with. Now, the entity's asylum houses not one but 2 of its minions. The obvious one is the one I mentioned before, Sally Smithson, former nurse and victim of Crotus Prenn. It isn't confirmed, but it's very likely that she was the woman living in the ruins and the primary source that the entity would have taken its image of the asylum from, as I've mentioned. The second is the clown, once known as Jeffrey Hawk, who takes up residence at the chapel belonging to Father Campbell that ran on the asylum grounds. Sally's involvement makes sense, but the clown and the carnival taking place on the grounds is a little more nebulous. Jeffrey wouldn't even be born until, at my estimate, 50 or more years after the fire claimed the asylum. While the carnival was nomadic, never staying in the same place for long, it would be hard to justify it stopping in the uninhabited and definitely undesirable Crotus Prenn Asylum. A theory I've seen in a couple of places, and it's probably the best explanation since no ties are made explicitly, is that the clown found what would look like a place that was known for peace and joy. The entity could provide that with Sally's knowledge of the asylum's only refuge from the horrors that were being committed, despite the fact that Father Campbell was one of the only victims from the staff on the grounds. The chapel was known to be a place where patients could forget their worries and absolve themselves from their guilt. And what better place for a carnival wagon to stop than the one place of happiness in an otherwise terrible spot? As far as the layout is concerned, Father Campbell's chapel is, well, exactly that. It's a large place of worship settled into a dark and foreboding clearing. Just outside, sits the carnival, illuminating the otherwise gray landscape with a fortune-telling machine and some booths. At the very least, we know where the clown resides, even if he can't leave anymore. Not that he needs to. The most startling sight to see, though, is Maurice. Now, there are some theories behind Maurice, especially since he appears at first glance to be a living, breathing horse alongside the carnival. Getting a closer look, maybe a little too close, it becomes clear that the horse has a third eye. There isn't a natural way to explain that, but since he isn't quite dead, the most sound theory would be that he was pulled through somehow alongside the clown. Why the third eye, then? The best and seemingly most popular theory is that when the horse was being pulled through, its eyes were burnt out. The entity granted it the third eye so that it could still see. Why show mercy to this horse, though, when it seems the entity can barely show sympathy for its minions? Either the horse, like the crows scattered throughout the trials, is now an agent of the entity, or the clown is one of the more sadistic and devout of the entity's worshippers, and granting Maurice sight again, grotesque as it may be, was a wish being granted. Perhaps there are rewards for those that do as they're expected. There isn't much to be said about the disturbed ward, the other part of Crotus Prenn. That wouldn't surprise anyone familiar with these kinds of buildings. The ward, where the nurse probably spent most of her time, is the last standing piece of the main structure. Remnants of the shock therapy center still remain, and judging by the size of the place, more dubious means of treatment were lost in the fire. In the real world, it's still standing, and most likely a source of urban legends due to its popularity with teenagers in the area years later, despite it seeming to ward away anyone not seeking thrills, including one in particular, Near Carlson, graffiti artist turned survivor. It's not hard to wonder if the mess of broken beds and burnt-out ruins might have attracted other thrill-seekers who could have wound up in the entity's web. Perhaps Kate Denson's secret getaway might have also been on the Crotus Prenn grounds, or at least someplace the clown's caravan may have stopped, like it has in the entity's version of Father Campbell's chapel. With a past rife with tortured souls and twisted minds, the Crotus Prenn Asylum is the perfect place for the entity to find its next unsuspected target. And those who go there now would most likely have the makings of perfect survivors. Well, that's it for this Sit by the Campfire. Once again, if you have any questions or comments, I'm all for constructive or deconstructive conversation. If you have any suggestions about what you'd like to hear about next, or just want to reach out, feel free to leave a comment or find me on Twitter at CampfireTender. Thanks for listening. Until next time.